for listening and for being here today. And with that, let's go to our first panel. The state budget is Kentucky's most important policy document. And as the saying goes, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. And this year is really especially pivotal, and much is at stake in the state budget debate. So I'm going to hand it off first to our senior fellow, Pam Thomas, who's going to go over the revenue picture going into the budget. After that, we'll pass it off to our research director, Ashley Spalding, who will review what was going on with spending in the period leading up to the budget. And then I'll review where we are in terms of the House budget, the governor's budget, and what may be coming as far as potential changes to our tax system. So I'll hand it off now to Pam.
All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us at the conference today. As you all probably know, the General Assembly has a historic budget surplus and strong revenues continue, which is unprecedented and really unusual for us here in Kentucky. So my part of the presentation, I'm going to briefly review where we are from a revenue standpoint, and it's better than it's been in many, many, many years, and that's for a number of factors that I'm going to touch on briefly. So I'll do the overview in three parts. First, I'll talk about the general fund, which is where a majority of state tax revenues are deposited. Second, I'll talk a little bit about the rainy day fund, which has grown to unprecedented levels in Kentucky. And then third, I'm going to talk about federal COVID relief funds that Kentucky already has received and will receive. And then finally, I'll end with a talk about how the tax cuts that we've had session after session have led us to chronic underinvestment in state government and the disinvestment that has brought us to where we are today. So let's begin then with the general fund. When COVID hit, everyone expected state revenues to plummet and to be dramatically impacted as businesses were closed and people had to stay home and they weren't able to work. However, that really never happened. And that was primarily thanks to robust federal aid provided to individuals, businesses, states, and local governments. Back in 2020, when the pandemic was just beginning and the General Assembly was in session, revenue estimates were reduced and they passed a one-year flatlined budget for 2021 because of all of the fiscal uncertainties. When they came back then at the end in 2021, at the beginning of 2021, they were faced with enacting another one-year budget. And contrary to predictions, revenues held up well and actually exceeded expectations. But because the pandemic continued and the uncertainty continued, the consensus estimates at that time anticipated only modest growth, and the General Assembly passed another austere, mainly flatlined budget. And then despite all of those uncertainties that prevented additional investments, they also passed $161 million in new tax cuts. But then again, contrary to projections, and this is really sort of the story of the last few years, revenues continued through 2021 to be strong, and fiscal year 2021 ended with a historic revenue surplus of $1.1 billion, and that's billion with a B. That was the greatest surplus in Kentucky history, with actual revenues that were 10.9% over the estimates. All but $10 million of that amount was deposited in the Budget Reserve Trust Fund or the Rainy Day Fund, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Let's fast forward then to this year. Originally, revenues for the current year were forecasted to be 7.6% less than actual receipts in 2021. But contrary to that forecast, the very strong revenue growth continued, and it was revised by the CFG in December, increasing the original estimate by $1.94 billion. That's the year we're in right now, just to make it clear. And that's 16% greater than the estimate that the current year budget is based on. So and that estimate, I just want to note, includes a $225 million settlement with PokerStars. That was from a lawsuit that was filed several years ago about offshore gambling companies that were operating illegally in our state. So if we take the $1.94 billion I mentioned earlier, and then the $1.1 billion from 2021, that adds up to just under $3 billion of revenues that were not expected that we currently have. And so now I'd like to call your attention here to this slide, which shows the recurring revenue growth that were projected. So moving on, or I'm sorry, One of the important questions to ask with all of the significant growth rates and how much of the money is recurring revenues. And the reason that question is really important is that it's not fiscally prudent to spend one-time money on recurring expenses. And you've heard a lot of conversation about that in the media. And so we've also heard a lot of rhetoric around the idea that most of the surplus money we have now is one-time money. But when you really look at it, it's clear that that's not the case. And as this slide shows, we have close to $3 billion in new revenues expected this year compared to 2020, and revenue growth is projected to continue into the future, although at a more moderate rate. The consensus group predicts $294 million in additional revenues in 23 and $598 million more in 2024. But what this means in the bottom line is that this money can and should be spent on restoring budgets for agencies that have been cut to the bone over the past several years and investing in education and the people in Kentucky. And so now I'm going to move on to the one-time monies, and that's the Budget Reserve Trust Fund and federal funds. As noted previously, all but $10 million of the surplus from 2021, which was more than $1.1 billion, was deposited in the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. And that's what creates part of the second opportunity, which is one-time money. The money in the Budget Reserve Trust Fund became one-time money when it was placed in the fund and not expended by the General Assembly during the session. And the amount that's there is currently far beyond what we need to have a fiscally sound rainy day fund. The current balance in the state rainy day fund is $1.5 billion, which is 12.4% of general fund appropriations in the current year. And then for a little bit of context, prior to now, the rainy day fund balance has never exceeded 3.7% of general fund appropriations. So what this means is that there's room to both maintain a fiscally sound rainy day fund while appropriating money currently in the fund to address one-time expenditures. Well, for some reason, my slides are not advancing. Let me see if I can fix that. There we go. This slide combines the two things I've just discussed about in one slide in the context of the rainy day fund.
You haven't reshared. Oh, sorry, Pam, you haven't reshared your screen yet.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. I knew there had to be a glitch. All right. Am I resharing now?
Yes, you are.
All right, very good. Thank you, Natalie. So this slide combines the two things I've discussed into one slide in the context of the rainy day fund. And when we add together the amount already in the fund with the expected unbudgeted new revenues for the current fiscal year, we're at 28.4% of general fund expenditures. So we are really and truly in an unprecedented such situation with more opportunity to invest than has existed in well over 20 years. And that's all without even including the federal funds. Most of the federal relief funds provided to the state came through the CARES Act and ARPA, and although there have been a total of 7 revenue measures passed by Congress. In total, including all the federal aid bills that received by all executive branch agencies, Kentucky is going to get or has received over $16.9 billion. And of that amount, $10.1 billion has been spent. From the CARES Act, Kentucky got $7 billion, with $1.7 billion available to the General Assembly. And under ARPA, Kentucky will receive $6.7 billion, with $2.2 billion available for appropriation by the General Assembly. There's also ARPA money that goes for education and childcare, rental assistance, and other specific things, and also to state and local governments. The state, the counties, and the cities will all receive their second half of their ARPA allocations, probably right around May of 2022. Some of the city money and the local money might be a little bit later than that. And of that total amount, Kentucky still has $1.1 billion left. And once again, and so what this slide shows is that of the appropriations that have been made so far using the ARPA funds, the biggest part of that was to repay the unemployment insurance fund, followed by broadband, water, and sewer projects. And then it also shows that there's a remaining about $1.1 billion. And in addition to this, Kentucky is going to benefit significantly from the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has over $1.2 trillion in spending over 10 years. And that includes transportation funding, but it also includes things like broadband, sewer, and water projects, electrical vehicle charging stations, mine reclamation, brownfield reclamation, and also subsidies for people to help them afford internet access. One of the things that's happened, and the discussion for many, many years in Kentucky has really, and about the budget, has been about austerity and the lack of revenue and how the state can't afford to make adequate investments in schools, child welfare, and public health. But that narrative often excludes the impact of proliferating tax breaks on what we can afford. Kentucky's general fund is currently much smaller as a share of the state economy than it has been in the past. And if this slide just shows, if tax revenue had grown in step with the way our economy has grown, we would have about $3.3 billion more to spend than we have right now. The next thing I want to talk about, tax cuts are tax expenditures. And what I've got on the slide now is the definition of what a tax expenditure is that's from the 2022-24 Tax Expenditure Analysis. And the really important thing to note here is that tax expenditures are increasingly larger part of the state government expenditures without the need for explicit reapproval or authorization by full legislators. And as you know, every time the budget is done, there is a discussion about what to fund and what not to fund. But once a tax expenditure is on the books, it pretty much stays there and it's never really revisited. The 2022-24 Tax Expenditure Analysis lists close to $19 billion in tax expenditures over the biennium. And this slide lists just a few that were passed during the last legislative session. So based on the definition on the last slide, what this means is that before the first dollar is appropriated, slot machine operators, real estate developers, Hollywood production companies, and cryptocurrency miners get paid. For comparison, the $555 million spent over the biennium on just the tax breaks I've listed here on this slide would pay for a 5% increase in K-12 per pupil base funding, a $2,000 increase in state employee salaries, and textbooks with money left over. And so this slide is just an illustration of, it's called the Great Unraveling. And it starts in 1979 with the passage of the famous or infamous House Bill 44. At the time House Bill 44 was enacted, and that relates to property taxes, our state property tax rate was 32.1 cents per $100 in value. Since that time, our tax rate has gone down to 11.9 cents because of the increase in property tax bases. So the state is limited in the amount of money it can generate from the property tax, and that's automatic. And if you just follow the line all the way over, you can see that the big economic development incentive program started right around Toyota in 1988. And then we had tax increment financing. And then if we really jump forward to 2018 and 19, where we saw large tax cuts through a reduction in flattening and reducing of the top income tax rates to 5% from 6%, an increase in consumption taxes, and a repeal of the bank franchise taxes. That's kind of where we are now. And there were many, 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 many other tax cuts in between here, but I think you get the idea from this slide, how long this has been going on. And as we look at and think about who currently pays taxes in Kentucky, it's clear that Kentuckians who have less pay proportionately more, as illustrated in this graph. Our system has always been regressive, but was made more so over the past few years. And to illustrate how this is true, this graph is based on an analysis from ITEP, and it looks at the 2018 tax cuts, and it shows that there was a significant shift from those changes away from the most wealthy with higher taxes paid by everyone else. This upside down system disproportionately impacts people of color and people who live in rural areas, who are overrepresented in the income quintiles that have experienced the largest increases. And we're hearing from legislators that additional income tax cuts are likely on the horizon. Cuts that, if they happen, will further compromise our ability to invest in the Commonwealth. So where we are is that we're faced with the biggest opportunity to once again invest in the Commonwealth that we had since I've been around. And for those of you that know me, you know I've been around for a very long time. And but still, we are also faced with a large and very real threat that rather than investing, the General Assembly will instead create even more tax breaks that will further widen the existing equity gaps and reduce future revenues. And we all have a role to play in this, and we all have an opinion, and we all should be expressing those opinions and determining in which direction we'll go. And I urge you to engage and look forward to working with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, who's going to talk about where we are historically from the budget standpoint.
Thanks, Pam. And let's see about screen sharing. All right. Are you seeing my slides? I think so.
Yep.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Spalding, Research Director at KY Policy, and I will be providing an overview of state spending to provide context for the budget proposals that are currently in the legislature. And that context is, it's been a decade or more of cuts across critical services in these areas of the budget that you can see here on the slide. This is how our general fund monies were spent in 2022. That's $12 billion. And you can see that P through 12 education makes up a big portion of the budget, and I'll be talking about that first. As I talk about the different areas of the budgets and the very great budget needs we have, I will be touching some on where there have been important temporary but really important federal investments with COVID relief. And I also, as I'm going through the different budget areas, you may find yourselves wondering, does KY Policy have a report on this? How can I find out more? This is really interesting information, but it's at a high level. And spoiler alert, for going on our website, kypolicy.org, we do have many reports and analyses that go into more depth here. So I'm going to start out by talking about education. And you can see here, as I mentioned, P through 12 is a big portion. If you add P through 12 and higher ed, that's half the budget right there. So I'll be going into some detail about the education funding budget, which is really needed to provide this context. But before I get in the weeds, I want to step back and talk about what the big picture story is here with education funding. And it is that we are, as a state, are inadequately funding our public education system. And it's providing us, leading to a situation where our school districts are very challenged in their ability to be able to provide a high quality education to all Kentucky kids. This slide here provides some highlights of the impacts of funding freezes and cuts that we're seeing in education. This is from a survey that we did with school districts a few years ago, and we asked them, what are the impacts of funding freezes and cuts? And we heard that this is affecting, districts are having to make difficult choices. They're often cutting back on things and also trying to raise more revenue locally in order to make up for these funding issues, or a combination of both of these things. And so we're seeing instructional days cut in some cases, programs cut, student supports, and districts have been having to reduce staff at that point even, and being unable to give needed raises and not being able to cover instructional costs. I want to just pause for a minute and adjust my lighting a little bit. Natalie told me this was the best lighting for me, and then I seem to have picked a poor time of day to, let's see, it's kind of in my face a little. Okay, maybe not. So I am going to start talking in more detail then about education funding. And core funding for Kentucky's public schools is distributed through the SEEK formula, which stands for Support Education Excellence in Kentucky. And We hear that term used a lot. So what is SEEK? It provides state funding to school districts based on property wealth and local effort. And it's the largest component of education funding in Kentucky. It includes what's called a base guarantee that is established in every budget, that a base guarantee per student that's established in every budget. And we hear a lot about this, where's the base per pupil guarantee in a budget? Is it at historic levels or not? The per pupil guarantee is currently at $4,000, where it's been since 2019. In comparison, it was $3,822 in 2008, which is before there was a decline in funding following as a result of the Great Recession. It's important to understand that the base per pupil guarantee is a combination of state and local funding. So out of that $4,000, some of it is state funding and some is local, and that's really important to understand. So as you can see in this graph here, the blue bars show the state funding for the per pupil guarantee, and the light blue bars are the local portion. And you can see that the state portion has been going down and the local portion has been going up, that locals have been paying for more of that. And so when we hear claims about historic levels of education funding with the per pupil guarantee, we have to look critically to understand what that means in terms of the state investment. And here it's very much been declining. It's been cut in inflation adjusted terms by 26% since 2008. Talking about the SEEK formula, I also want to mention briefly that the SEEK formula provides for half-day kindergarten funding, and most districts actually provide full-day kindergarten, but they pay for that with local funds because the state just provides the half-day funding. And research has shown that this is a really important investment in kids' academic success, and so districts have cut back in other areas to make that happen. But in the 2022 budget, for the first time and for 1 year only, the kindergarten was funded at full day, which is important to know. So when we don't fund SEEK adequately, what ends up happening is that the funding gap between Kentucky's poorest and wealthiest school districts grows. And here you can see in the graph that in terms of that gap between the poorest and wealthiest districts, we're actually almost back to where we were before the Kentucky Education Reform Act passed in 1990. And the Kentucky Education Reform Act, or KERA, is actually passed to address these very funding inequities. But when adequate funding isn't put into SEEK, these inequities occur. Another part of SEEK is transportation, and the state has not been covering its statutory obligation of paying 100% of the costs of transporting kids to and from school since 2004. Right now in 2022, it's about 60% funded. And so local districts have to take on those costs. And that's when these difficult choices they're faced with because they're having these pressures. So outside of SEEK, there are several education programs that I want to highlight and talk about where we are with funding. We've seen no funding for textbooks or instructional materials since 2018, no funding for teacher professional development. Extended school services, our schools after school programs, they've been flatline funded. Family resource and youth services centers, or FRISCIs, provide important wraparound services for families in many of our communities that particularly help low-income children's families, school children's families. And we've just seen modest increases with FRISCI's funding. And I want to mention preschool as one of these programs as well. And preschool funding's been pretty flat, but what it covers is that, in recent years, but what it covers is important to know. This is tuition-free preschool for 4-year-olds in low-income families in Kentucky, and then 3 and 4-year-old children with developmental delays and disabilities regardless of income. A lot of our early childhood education actually occurs in childcare centers. And here you can see in this alarming graph, the childcare providers have been closing their doors. We've seen a serious decline in the number of childcare centers, and half of Kentuckians live in what's considered to be a childcare desert, where there isn't childcare or there isn't enough. This is almost entirely because we've lost almost half of childcare providers over the past 10 years, in part due to funding cuts or other ways that funding's been inadequate. There have been some important investments in childcare in recent years where the providers have gotten some more money for reimbursement rates, and there's been some expansion of who can qualify. But we need greater state investment to be able to sustain and expand access to childcare and to see a difference in this graph here. Federal COVID relief funds have been really important here with childcare. About $1 billion have propped up this industry in our state, and that's been really important. But these investments are temporary. And I'm realizing I meant to mention federal funding with the P through 12 education. And actually, our schools have received about $3 billion in federal funds for COVID-specific needs, and that includes physical health and mental health and learning supports. And at the same time, those investments have been so critical. They also are targeted toward COVID needs, and they are temporary. And so they don't make up for the lack of state investment. State funding for higher education has also declined. This is a 33% decline in inflation-adjusted terms for our state funding for our public universities, the 8 public universities, and our 16 community colleges. As a result, we've seen college become less affordable as the institutions have raised tuition and fees over time, and not as much so recently, but over time, tuition and fees have gone up a lot and made college less affordable. And this has been in part because of cuts, because the institutions are trying to cover some of the costs, some of the revenue that they've lost. Also want to mention that as we've seen a decline in state funding, of the funding that the state does provide for higher ed, more of it has been shifted to be distributed through a performance funding pool based on certain metrics. And each year we're seeing that there are certain universities that receive no performance funds, and those are primarily the ones that serve the most low-income students and students of color, Kentucky State and Morehead State. And then with the community colleges, there are 6 community colleges that have received 0 performance funds year after year. And those are in some of our poorest communities. So before I move on, related to college affordability, despite the college affordability challenges in Kentucky, which are considerable, and yes, we do have a report on that, it's important to know that the state's need-based scholarships, which namely the College Access Program, that those amounts have only gone up a little bit. And so in terms of really paying for the cost of college, there's a long way to go there. The video that you saw at the beginning that we showed talked a lot about Medicaid and the importance of Medicaid expansion in Kentucky. And it has served a really critical role during the pandemic as well, as you can see here. Medicaid is the second single general fund appropriation in the state budget, behind only P through 12 education. And Medicaid provides health coverage for more than 1/3 of Kentuckians. And it's been especially significant in the height of the pandemic, as you can see in this graph. Much of the Medicaid costs, which have been going up, understandably, is borne by the federal government, which is why the title of this slide is Medicaid's a Good Deal for Kentucky. The portion that the federal government pays for traditional Medicaid went up during the pandemic. So that is part of that. In addition to providing health insurance, Medicaid provides important support programs for persons with disabilities, and those include the Michelle P. waiver and the Supports for Community Living, or SCL waiver. And those waiting lists have been growing, and they're such important programs, and in the past couple of budgets, there haven't been new slots added. And so we have a big need there. I'll turn now to public services and, human services, this kind of broad category we call human services, and give a couple of examples of how we're seeing cuts here as well. Because of increased pension requirements and repeated rounds of budget cuts and a stagnation in public sector pay, we've seen this steep decline in the public health workforce. There have been some additional state and local investments to address COVID needs during the pandemic, but they're temporary. Also, we know that our social worker turnover is harming Kentucky's child welfare system. And that's largely due to low pay and high caseloads. It's also a very stressful job. In 2021 alone, around 650 caseworkers left. And as of June 2021, 44% of those that remained had less than a year of experience. The Department for Behavioral Health, Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities has not received a meaningful state funding increase since the 1990s, and it was cut by 4.3% in the 2018 to 2020 budget. And the Department of Aging and Independent Living hasn't received a meaningful increase in funding for years either, despite our state's growing aging population. There is one area of the budget that has been going up, where we've seen increased investments, and that is corrections in Kentucky. The number of people incarcerated is driving this a lot. And you can see where it's growing over time, and I'll talk a little bit about why, but it goes down in 2021 with the pandemic. And part of that is the governor's sentence commutations. And also there are a backlog of cases due to court closures. But I can assure you that this downward trend has been short-lived, and incarceration is going up and related costs are going up. The corrections budget was $626 million for 2022, which is 72% higher than was appropriate in 2010. And to make a comparison, over that same period of time, general fund expenditures have grown just 45%. So that is happening because largely because of policy choices, and our legislature keeps passing more and more policies to increase incarceration rather than reduce it, as you can see in this graph, which shows that it's actually 6 times as many laws in the past 10 years, and that's when the last big reform happened. Natalie, do you have your hand raised? Oh, I think that's a warning for me. Okay.
I do. Thank you. You've got about 2 minutes.
Okay. So a big theme of what I've been talking about has been about state workers and the issues with their salaries. I should mention public defenders, which is a constitutional service that in our justice system, in our criminal justice system, that those salaries have been low, and that's causing a lot of critical issues. And state salaries have been stagnant. There's also a big issue because of the pensions, the shift away from defined benefit pensions in 2013. That's causing a lot of retention problems as well. So these are very concerning trends. Speaking of pensions, just very quickly, there's been a lot of discussion about how much should go into the pension systems. And as long as we are funding them, as we have been in recent years, return to putting in the defined benefit contribution, our plans will be healthy. So the idea that we should put a lot more money now into our pension systems, more than the defined, more than the actuarially determine contribution, that actually just isn't the case. And we have a lot, we've published a lot on that issue. So I will just provide this quick slide about, Pam mentioned the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act infrastructure investments, which are really exciting. And we have a lot of budget needs there with roads and bridges and environmental issues. And I will sum up that we have a historic opportunity here to make needed investments in these many areas that I've been talking about in our state. The needs are great after so many years of cuts. So I'll pass it over to Jason now to talk about the House and the governor's budgets.
All right, so that brings us up to the current session, where we are dealing with really, as Pam and Ashley have described, a really unique situation. And there's money on the table for a change to reinvest in the things that have been cut. And that's thanks to the federal stimulus that was provided to the economy. But the real question is, what do we do about it? And we have a couple of budgets that have been introduced already. The governor put out his proposal. The House has now passed its version of the budget as of last night. There is a distinct difference between those budgets, and you can actually put a dollar figure on it. It's about $1.1 billion. Both budgets make reinvestments. There's so much money on the table that you can't not reinvest some in the budget, but the House budget's reinvestments are fairly modest, as I'll go through, considering the amount of resources that are on the table. And so it spends about $1.1 billion less than what the governor proposed in his plan, much of which, as I'll go through, is about education, P-12 education, although there are other things as well. So the question is, if they're not going to reinvest that and they're not putting that in the rainy day fund, what are they using it for? And tax cuts certainly seem to be on the table. But this is the major choice that is facing the General Assembly this session. Of course, it's the General Assembly's decision, not the governor's. They have the constitutional authority to do the budget, but the governor's proposal helps frame the discussion. And we've already seen in the House budget them make changes to at least move somewhat in the direction of more spending. There was a $1.7 billion discrepancy between what they proposed and what the governor proposed in the first version. Yesterday, they added some new spending, including in some important new areas. So there is already somewhat of a shift, but certainly the tax cuts are still on the table. So to go into some detail about different aspects of this budget and building on what's already been said, the question with P-12 education, or the most important question, is what happens to that base SEEK formula, that core funding formula for schools? And both budgets, the House budget and the governor's budget, increase it from $4,000 per pupil up to $4,200 in the House and $4,500 in the governor's plan. But as Ashley mentioned, SEEK is a state plus local state and local money is involved. So just because the state per pupil amount goes up, it doesn't mean the state's putting in any more money at all. And in fact, that's what happens in the House budget. The state contribution actually decreases by $38 million over the biennium compared to what's put in now in the House plan. In the governor's plan, the state money does increase by $199 million. And if you adjust for inflation, you can see what happens in this graph is the continuing decline of basic form of funding from the state would continue to go down in the House plan. In the governor's plan, it would actually begin to go up. We're not obviously anywhere close to making up the ground that we've lost since 2008, but the trajectory would begin to change if you put that kind of money in it. If you stuck with what the House proposed, the trajectory would not change. Beyond that basic, there's other really important differences between what's on the table. Student transportation, which Ashley mentioned, the state is not fully funded since 2004. The governor's plan would fully fund that, adding $175 million a year. The House plan still does not fully fund that. It adds $60 million, but that would still keep us shy of full funding in many districts. And it distributes it in a way that is not based on need, but is the same amount per county. So there's a discrepancy there. Another big discrepancy has to do with preschool. The House budget does not add any money for preschool. The governor's budget proposes for the first time universal preschool for all 4-year-olds, which would cost $172 million. So that's another big initiative that he has put forward that is not in the House plan. There's other school funding differences. One really important one, given the workforce challenges that we face in state government because of these lack of raises for so long, has to do with raises for teachers and school employees. The governor's both requires a 5% raise first year and includes a new student loan forgiveness program for new teachers of $56 million. The House, though, doesn't include any requirement about a raise or student loan. And the government, and also just puts less money into the districts, which makes it harder, especially for those poorer districts, to be able to afford a raise. Governor's money also restores the money, budget also restores the money for textbooks. The House budget does not. There are some new supports that the governor proposes as well, particularly for those needy schools and kids that are not in the House budget. One bright spot in the House budget is they do increase the amount that goes to family resource and youth service centers, which are a really important part of our schools. Both budgets do, but the House actually went beyond the recommendation. And then there's funding for libraries to do operating support that has been stripped from the budget, even though it's required by law a few years ago. The governor would restore that, but the House does not restore those operating grants for schools. So you can see that there are significant differences, particularly in the area of education, in what the House has put on the table and what the governor had proposed. In higher education, we see some similar trends. The House does put a little bit more money the first year into the institutions, cuts the amount a little bit in the second year. The governor just puts in more. The House also put the money into that performance pool we talked about. It tends to leave out students with more, institutions with more students of color, low-income students. The governor did not do that in his budget. He also increased the size of a need-based scholarship that we offer. As you can see, a real similar trend if you look at the long-term trajectory that Ashley had reviewed. In the House budget, we sort of tread water. We're more or less where we were before. In the governor's budget, we at least begin to tick back up in terms of institution funding. State employee raises are somewhat similar for each of the plans. There's a little bit of differences, but essentially a 6% bonus the first year, and then some targeted bonuses for social workers, state police, and other positions. The House does include a raise for public defenders, which the governor's budget did not include. But more or less, they're the same. These are, after not having received raises for 10 of the last 12 years for state employees, these are certainly a step in the right direction, but obviously much more would be needed in future years to address the serious workforce shortages and challenges that state government has because they cannot pay what the private sector offers. And we've eliminated pensions since 2013 for state employees. They're not in a traditional pension plan. In terms of health and human services, again, there are some differences. The governor's plan does put more into certain things like adding more social workers. Both plans add social workers, but they add more, increasing the slots for people with disabilities. They put a little more into supporting the pension costs of these health departments. And there are some specific equity-related efforts that we just quit funding. The state in all the budget cuts just quit funding the Commission on Women entirely, the Office of the Minority Empowerment entirely. The governor restores that funding and puts $300,000 more to the Commission on Human Rights, but the House budget does not include that. Also, the governor's budget has a real large increase for programs for people facing domestic violence, rape crisis centers, et cetera, about $4 million a year. The House budget does not include those. There are some other one-time investments. There's quite a bit of infrastructure funding in both budgets. I won't go through this in the interest of time, but we'll have the slides available for you all to look at another time. But in both budgets, there is a fair bit of infrastructure investment. In terms of pensions, as Ashley mentioned, our pensions are actually on a very good trajectory since we started making the actuarially determined contribution. And of course, investment returns are really good last year. And so the plans added $10 billion from just investment returns alone. But both plans make the full actuarially determined contribution and go above that. In similar amounts, you can see $894 million above in the House, $750 million above in the governor's budget. So this is a very aggressive budget in both cases for pension funding. And then there's this $1 billion left in the American Rescue Plan Act money. That's federal money. And there are some differences in how those are appropriated. The governor is talking about hero pay for essential workers. That's the biggest item that he proposed at $400 million. The House put most of their money into water and wastewater, more money into the unemployment trust fund, which was again done last year. That has the function of lowering business taxes that would have just gone up a little bit the next few years. So it's really a business tax cut that has been the major way in which the legislature has used those funds, unfortunately. They also put some more money into broadband. The governor's plan includes some water and wastewater monies as well, but also money to continue to fight COVID. Some aid programs to the most vulnerable, particularly nonprofits that serve people who've been hurt by COVID. Money for senior meals. There are about 7,000 seniors that would get on a waiting list for senior meals otherwise. He proposed that. This is one change the House made yesterday that is good. They're using some general fund money to at least increase it, not to the amount the governor proposed, but they did make that change. And then the other things are for, like student loan forgiveness for nurses, as we try to attract nurses in a very difficult environment, childcare and other needs. And then both budgets leave substantial dollars unspent. The governor's budget does add money to the rainy day fund. We already have $1.5 billion in the rainy day fund, which, as mentioned earlier, is far more than we've ever had, and really a very good amount of money for this point as you think about the next recession. On average, they come about every 8 years. If you look back in time, we are very well positioned. But the governor adds another $250 million to that. And then the House, again, to go back to the big, I think, theme of this session, leaves $1.1 billion unappropriated. So don't put it in the rainy day fund. It is sort of out there. And you can see that these amounts as a share of our budget, 12% in the governor's budget, 18% in the House budget. Those are really amounts, especially 18%, far more than we will need to prepare for the next recession. So the real question, the real mystery is, what's going to happen to that $1.1 billion? What's the plan? And what's going to be the impact on the budget, both short and long term, as well as on Kentuckians? So we don't know, and a plan will be forthcoming, but there's definitely a big concern about additional income tax cuts on top of the income tax cuts that we saw in 2018. One important thing to understand about this is that it's very, very expensive to begin to cut income taxes. Just to cut our 5% income tax to 4% would cost $1.1 billion a year. It would take all that surplus in 1 year. That's more money than we spend on all of our universities and community colleges combined. If you just dropped it 1/10 of a point from 5 to 4.9%, that's more money than we spend on preschool. So it's very, very expensive to make tiny, tiny changes in the income tax. And the winners of that are overwhelmingly people with higher incomes, which is what this graph shows. If we did a cut to 4%, this is how much money folks would receive. The income tax, even in Kentucky, where it's a flat tax, because of deductions and because we have a low income credit, it's actually still graduated. And so when you give an income tax cut, when you cut the rate, the biggest beneficiary is that top 1% who make $1.426 million a year on average. They would get an $11,000 tax cut. So that's what would happen to that surplus if we were to go in that direction. And if they were to reduce the income tax in a way that was permanent, so it wasn't just for this budget, but was for future years, we would either have to cut the budget dramatically in the future or raise the sales tax. And if you had a 1% cut in the income tax, the sales tax would have to go up from 6 to 7.4%, according to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. That's the highest state sales tax in the country. And the impact in who pays is the complete opposite of the income tax. As a share of people's income, the sales tax is much more on the lower end. And that's just because working class, poor working class, and middle income people spend all of their income out of necessity to make ends meet. So the sales tax is a bigger share of their family budget than those at the top who save a lot of their income and therefore don't see it be subject to the sales tax. So if we were to shift over to sales taxes, it would be a shift in who pays from that income tax cut. And this would be the net effect of those two things combined. The bottom 60% would pay more in overall taxes in Kentucky. The top would pay less, especially the top 1%. In addition to income tax cuts, we know that, especially at a time when there's a lot of surplus monies on the table, there are a lot of corporate lobbyists pushing for specific tax cuts beyond that. Corporate income tax cuts would likely come along with cuts in individual income tax. But as this graph showed, our corporate taxes, for the reasons Pam mentioned, have been declining as a share of our budget for decades as we've introduced these tax breaks and reduced the rate. There's also talk about weakening what's called the limited liability entity tax, which is sort of a tax created to help close a corporate loophole. There are other tax breaks moving on, go into all these, but there's a plan that would give a huge subsidy to these investment companies without any promise that they would create jobs. There have been efforts to eliminate the inheritance tax, which applies to very few people at higher incomes, et cetera. So there's a big concern, I think, that there are other tax cuts, either part of the package or separately, can go through. And this surplus, although it's large, would go away very quickly if we were to head down that route. And it's very important to understand that the narrative that this is about economic development, that reducing our income taxes and corporate taxes is about economic development, just doesn't match reality. And we have plenty of evidence of that. And there are a lot of states that have experimented with these income tax cuts over the last couple of decades. This graph showed in states like Maine and Kansas and Ohio, Wisconsin, they reduced their income tax. And in the period thereafter, their economies grew slower than the national average. Not faster, but slower. And in fact, if you look at the 9 states that have the highest top tax rates, so the rate on millionaires is highest, their growth over the last decade is faster than those states like Tennessee, Texas, that have no income tax at all. In the 12 states that have enacted millionaires taxes, so this is a popular thing that some states are doing, they had growth equal or exceeded nearby states. So this narrative that we need to do that for our economy has it exactly backward. And why is that? Well, it's sort of common sense if you think about it. But for one, public investment creates a foundation for well-being. The things that we fund through our budget, and our budget is about 6% of our economy. It's not that much. But when we fund things like transportation, like education, like healthcare, mental health, broadband, the arts, those are the things that contribute to quality of life. They promote innovation, they support business formation, and they make our economy more competitive overall. There's no question about that. And the states that have done more in public investment are the leading and most prosperous states in the country. It's also the case that when you give away tax cuts to those at the top, to corporations and wealthy individuals, they leave communities because those folks, they may export that money out of state. They may put it in a savings account or in an investment account that exists somewhere else, and it leaves our communities. But when we put dollars into raises for teachers, into expanded preschool, into improved infrastructure, it circulates money in our economy and keeps it moving. And that is essential to building an overall strong economy. So when we increase taxes on those at the top and reinvest those in communities, that increases this flow and helps make our economy grow. I'll just close here again with this choice that the General Assembly is facing. It has implications, particularly if we end up with a tax cut that continues in future years and not just a one-time rebate, far in the future, because this is our chance to pivot from the cuts that we've seen since 2008 We can expand public investment. It will strengthen our economy. If we protect our revenue stream at the same time, we can continue to make more investments in the future in return from those trends of the post-2008 level. But if we create tax cuts, if we pass big tax cuts, and if they're made permanent, we're going to see additional budget cuts. And those things are going to weaken, in addition to tax increases on the bottom. And those things are going to weaken our quality of life and our economy overall. So that was a lot. I'm going to stop there. Thank you all. And we are going to turn it over at this point to any questions. You're welcome to put those in the Q&A, or I believe you can also raise your hand. We may be able to call on you.
We did have a question in the chat, and I just want to make sure that Dustin answers your question. And like Jason just said, if you do raise your hand, use that raise your hand function, I can allow you to speak if you'd like to ask your question instead of putting it in the Q&A. Oh, there. Jason, can you see the Q&A?
Yeah, are there any new bills related to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency? And as Pam mentioned in the last session, there were new tax breaks introduced for cryptocurrency mining that are going to cost about $27 million a year. But I'm going to turn to Pam. Have you looked? I believe there are some bills that have been introduced, but I'm going to turn it over to Pam.
There are a couple of bills introduced that would create an infrastructure in Kentucky for Bitcoin to be sort of traded and regulated, one which would create like a new, I guess you'd think about it as a banking institution, because currently banks can't deal in cryptocurrency. So it would create another kind of financial organization that could hold cryptocurrency. And then the other one is to address issues with the Uniform Commercial Code, which is one of the ways that businesses regulate and determine how tangible property gets traded. And cryptocurrency is a little bit odd with regard to where it falls as a tangible property or an intangible property, as a currency or not a currency. And so the states that are more progressive in this, which are typically the ones that you see that have kind of fairly bad policies with regard to regulation of corporations, like South Dakota, are doing these things now. And so Senator Brandon Smith has introduced bills to do both of those things. In this session, he also introduced them last session, but they didn't get a hearing. He did introduce them at the end of the session. Those are the only two that I've seen. There may be some other folks on here that are following the issue that know a little bit more, but those are the ones that I've seen.
Well, Jason, I think it's good to give people a little break. Let them take a second to do all the things. If you're up for that, I'll share my screen for the what's up next, and you can give us a little bit of a lay of the land type of talk.
Sure. And if there are any other questions that folks have, after this about the budget and context, we're glad to sort of help with that. You can be in touch with us. We do have an analysis of the governor's budget as well as the House budget on our website in a fair bit of detail. We are going to update that as well based on what the House was able to, or what the changes that the House made yesterday. But those resources are also available on our website. All right, well, if there are no other questions, we will let you all take a break, and we come back, I believe, at 10:15 is that correct, Natalie?
Yes, 10:15. And if Alan is on, no, could you throw the link for the next meeting into the chat, please, as well? Because we will have 2 different Zoom links for the next simultaneous meetings. And as you can see on this link, where we ask for you all to come back to, we have this reversing harmful policies for the war on drugs. And then the other link that I'm hoping someone can put in the chat for me, looks like it might be there soon, is care work is essential. Investing in it will benefit us all. And you do have all of these links in your email as well. Yes, Alan has put that other link in the chat, so please copy it if you're planning on going to that session. Otherwise, come back here at 10:15 and we'll be ready to go for you.